Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first recording in our course with experts specialized in the European neighborhood policy. We are delighted to have as our first guest in our series Dr. Dimitrios TRIANTAPHYLLOU. Dimitrios TRIANTAPHYLLOU is Professor of International Relations at the Faculty of Economics, Administrative and Social Sciences, Kadir Has University Istanbul. His teaching and research interests are mainly focused on views foreign and security policy, EU neighborhood policy, Black Sea, Southeastern European and Mediterranean security, and the Greek-Turkish relations. And he has written extensively on these topics. All in all, I believe Professor TRIANTAPHYLLOU is the right person to talk us today about the EU's role internationally and in the Eastern neighborhood. The main subjects we study in the first unit of our MOOC, dedicated to theoretical conceptualization of EU's actorness internationally and in the Eastern neighborhood. Professor, we are very happy to welcome you to our online platform.
I'm delighted to be here with you.
I will start with some general questions, which are very much linked to the topics covered by our first class. Professor, how would you assess the present-day EU actorness internationally? Is the EU still an important global actor, or the EU's global reach and clout has been somehow shrinking in the last couple of years?
Yeah, this is a very important and relevant question, because at the level of perceptions, one would think that the EU's clout and reach has been shrinking. And even though the EU is active everywhere and has an expanding role. And I think one of the ways of assessing it is because we find ourselves, frankly, in the midst of systemic change, where, you know, the multilateral deliberate order that we knew is being somehow redone, dismantled and reconfigured into one of a polycentric world, with the emergence of a number of poles, which are not just the ones we've had. You know, it's not only the 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations anymore, it's a number of regional countries also reaching that level, and poles that do not necessarily interact with each other the way they interacted in the past. And in that sense, the EU, since all these poles except for the EU are unitary states, the EU as a special sui generis sort of construct from the beginning, but even more so today, has a very different sort of governance structure and decision-making structure, which makes decisions difficult to reach, policies and instruments difficult to actually, you know, there's a bargaining process internally, bargaining process within member states, bargaining process at EU level between member states, bargaining process between member states and EU institutions, and also between EU institutions. It's a very complicated construct which has an impact on what it actually does. And therefore, as we are in the midst of systemic change, and there seems to be a speeding up of developments, crises emerging in the EU's neighborhoods, whether it's the Eastern neighborhood or the Southern neighborhood, but in other parts of the world, then the question is, well, where is the EU? Because you never hear at first the EU and its potential to act as a stabilizer, as an institution that can bring about some sort of conflict resolution or whatever else. You'll hear about countries stepping in, but not necessarily the EU. The EU always comes later, and that's because of the nature, as I said, of how it functions, and its policies are obviously designed at building other sorts of links. You know, it's trade links and societal links and connectivity, another key term that the EU now uses more in its relations with the rest of the world, in particular with Asia, and not only. And so the EU ultimately, on the one hand, if you see its evolution, especially in the area of foreign policy and everything we've had in the foreign policy realm, including its policies towards its neighbors, has obviously shown, since the end of the Cold War, tremendous evolution and success, because it's doing things. But on the other hand, the reaction to what we see, it shows that the EU is not necessarily there as a political maybe actor. You hear about individual EU member states stepping up, the big ones in particular, Germany's role in certain crises, France's role, Italy's depending on the situation, but you never hear about the EU. The EU comes a bit later. And I think, therefore, it's a very complicated, I mean, so what is the EU's clout? Has it been shrinking? Yes and no. No, because its instruments are still there. It still is the biggest donor of humanitarian assistance in the world. It still is the biggest donor of development assistance. It still is a big trading bloc, never mind the fact that it might be shrinking in relation to China. It still is a substantive trading bloc that is growing in a sense. But these are not what one expects when crises erupt, you know, at first hand. These are not issues that one deals with when in the midst of the systemic change. And so these instruments, policies are still there, and the EU in that sense is active, but it's not active in terms of being the actor, and I'm talking about actors, international actors, state actors, and others such as the EU, that will be considered to step in, to have a voice about certain issues. And so the answer is yes, it has clout, and yes, it doesn't have.
Thank you, Dimitri. Now traveling to the post-Soviet space in Eastern Europe, what do you think, what are the main challenges the EU's actorness in the Eastern neighborhood has nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the fundamental elements and the fundamental challenges is how the notion of the EU as a transformative power, which was fundamental in particular in its enlargement, its Big Bang enlargement, right, where a lot of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe managed to join the EU in 2004, and by extension one thought that this transformative power would be applied to the new neighbors, right, to the EU's neighbors today, not necessarily for them to join, but at least the pull and the weight and the gravitas of the EU on all fronts would raise or force, into quotation marks, the leaderships of countries, neighboring countries, to adapt and adopt and ensure the sustainability of whatever reforms have occurred. And even though they might not be ready, or the EU has no mechanism to allow them to join the European Union, at least they're adapting and adopting their political, their economic, the social systems to the ones that the EU and its member states share. And so that's transformative, and with societies wanting this, but it's lost its edge. The transformative is not there. And I think this is something that maybe the EU does not necessarily realize, even though, again, if we evaluate EU involvement, EU influence, EU impact on its neighborhood, in particular its Eastern neighborhood, it has been tremendous. It has been tremendous. And the EU as a stakeholder in that region is recognized as such. But again, it's more painstaking work, which at times is not seen or noticed. And sometimes it's painstaking also for the societies that have to adapt and adopt anyway, because to create a web of, you know, trading partners, or even to go through the process of lifting, you know, going through visa liberalization processes for some of its neighbors, or even visa-free regimes for some of its neighbors, takes time and takes tremendous reform of institutions, in particular of the countries of its neighboring countries. But on the other hand, given the context and given the challenges, at times it's not seen necessarily as being as influential as it was once seen.
But Dimitri, do you believe the EU should offer an enlargement perspective for at least some of the Eastern neighbors? Would this be the breakthrough at the level of the bilateral relationship between the European Union and, say, the Republic of Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia? or simply this perspective is not realistic?
Yeah, yeah, because it's two questions. Should it offer? Absolutely. Is the EU ready to offer? No. And it's not realistic for me, not because these countries still have a lot of work to do. It's because the EU is not ready to actually sit down and go through this grand internal bargaining to say we're going to support this. And so, yes, you have supporters among EU member states with vested interests, especially states that have external borders, right, of the EU. Romania, your country, and other countries obviously do want this because it acts as a stabilizer. But the EU is not ready to do this. And it's interesting because the EU has not been ready for a long time. Even if we think in terms of the enlargement process, the Big Bang enlargement process, which allowed for 12 countries of eventually 12 countries or 10 of Central and Eastern Europe to join. The reason why this went through was because Germany, which at the time the process was launched, still was basically a frontline state, wanted to make sure that it would become go more to the center of Europe. It committed itself, it invested itself and took its national prerogative to become an EU prerogative to push through enlargement. Since then, and not only for that reason, that now it's not a frontline state necessarily, but for other reasons having to do with other crises that have emerged that are more of an internal challenge to the EU, Germany has stopped being the key supporter of this process, and there's no other power that has actually supported this totally, that has the weight, because you also need to have, I mean, the way the EU is structured, yes, all countries, all member states are equal, fine, and the majority of member states are small or very small, and this is a reality because they find themselves a web of security, stability, and prosperity that this offers. But nevertheless, if you really want policy to be agreed upon, bargained, negotiated, and finally reached, so that the EU could actually go tomorrow and say, Republic of Moldova, we're giving you an enlargement perspective. Ukraine, we're giving you an enlargement perspective. Georgia, we're giving you an enlargement perspective. You still need a big country like Germany or France, where the smaller, the medium-sized countries will coalesce around. And this is not happening. And so, yes, we should have an enlargement perspective, but the EU is not ready to do it.
This brings me to my next question, and I'm gonna ask you, what do you think is guiding the EU's approach in the Eastern neighborhood? Values or interests?
Yeah, I mean, this is a complicated question because I think the EU is coming to face with it. Part of the transformative power also had to do with, yes, the tangible results of actually what it means to adopt and adapt to EU norms and values, and society adapting and administrative systems and so on. And therefore, if one is outside, one sees this and says, I want this for my country as well. But the fact that we are going through a transition, which is not only systemic, but it's also the EU simultaneously facing multiple challenges, where even the notion of norms or values is being challenged by certain member states, and where the EU is having a tremendously difficult time coming to terms with it. And it's not just one country, it's 2 or 3 at different stages challenging it. And you know, and even though you have mechanisms within the EU which supposedly are there to work so that countries that do, you know, deviate from EU norms and values come back to the fold, means that there's no unity in the EU regarding this. And at the same time, the realization that the world is changing and that the EU needs to be also a bigger political actor and political force, and hence we have this thing about, you know, strategic autonomy, or the ECFR calls it strategic sovereignty, which I agree with that concept, and the need of fundamental reform and rethinking about what the EU's role in the world should be in this emerging geopolitical age. And so even words like geopolitics and so on have come from, and what do these mean? These mean interests. Yes, interests could also be, and have been for the EU, value-based. But right now, these are tremendously being challenged because, again, there is no consensus, I think, within the EU about what comes first. I think it depends. A country could say, well, no, the EU should be value-driven in terms of its actorness in general, but when it applies to its neighborhood and its external borders, there it says, well, because of the crises, well, there it should also be interest-driven, right? So there's no clear position on this thing, and again, this is where the EU has to go again through a total rethink about what its policy should be, whether this is a redefinition of neighborhood policy, whether as well as what is EU policy with regard to Russia, what is EU policy with regard to Turkey. Otherwise, we are just, you know, moving along and not really taking decisions, and therefore diluting at what is at the core of the EU, which should be values and interests together, right? And so I think it's a bit problematic right now.
I totally agree with you. So against this background, what are the ways forward to improve the relations between the European Union and the Eastern neighborhood, considering the fact that the Eastern Partnership, the European neighborhood policy these days are constantly under strain? What would be the fields, what would be the domains where the European Union perhaps should focus more for an improved relationship?
You know, one argument is, since the EU is not capable at this stage to adapt to the evolving strategic and geopolitical realities, it's still talking about doing something about it. So one argument is the EU should continue doing what it's been doing. Building those relationships, you know, that web of relations, that architecture, and making sure that it's on stable structures. And so even if it's shaken sometimes, whether by wind or earthquake or whatever, it does not fall. And so it should just be doing this. And but this is a recognition that the EU cannot be the primary actor, or is not considered as a key stakeholder for the security of these countries. Maybe it is for the prosperity, but it's not necessarily for their security, and therefore the EU also recognizes this. The other is, but from this, I go back to, and I'm always very critical of what the EU does wrong from inside, which means the EU really has to change its paradigm about itself and what it is, and it has to go through, maybe one is asking too much, through this grand bargaining process, rethink policies, rethink everything. And it does not mean creating new ones necessarily, even taking the Eastern Partnership and saying, okay, it might just be that it's, you know, giving the Eastern Partnership more political weight. I mean, interestingly enough, when the Eastern Partnership was conceived, and at the time the EU has two different sort of, but complementary policies vis-a-vis the region, the Eastern neighborhood. So one was this, you know, regional approach with the Black Sea synergy, which is also what the EU is actually about. But there, that regional approach was only, you know, it has not really, even the way it was structured, it was signed, the Black Sea synergy, only by foreign ministers. And there's never really been other foreign ministerials. It's basically been EU technocrats being involved in this process, and it never got the political weight or gravitas it needed, as opposed to the Eastern Partnership, which was something structured, saying there would be meetings every 2 years, heads of state or government meeting there, and therefore this is important for integration. But as you said, even that has sort of waned. Because it also shows the differences even among the sponsors within the EU for the Eastern Partnership. And so the EU has to fundamentally say, okay, the world is changing, we have to rethink this, but we have to sit down fundamentally and rework everything. And maybe this is the time, given the fact also that, you know, the conference on the future of Europe is about to start, and there is a foreign policy dimension to it, that maybe within this, and within the fact that ourselves, us as individuals, as citizens, as academics, as analysts, also in theory, because the platform allows for us to be in and invest and put out these ideas, that if we do this in a concerted effort, raising awareness that the EU also has to rethink fundamentally its policies, not only Eastern Neighbourhood, but here we're talking about the Eastern Neighbourhood. This might allow for the EU member states, its leaders and its institutions to say, okay, we need to do this, whether we like it or not. We need to sit down, go back to the drawing board, see what works, see what doesn't work, and give it higher political sort of priority again.
Yep, thank you so much. As you well know, in the recent couple of years, the European Union has focused more resources on the societies in the Eastern Neighbourhood countries in order to strengthen these relationship, this web of relations you were talking about. But how would you assess the way the European Union managed so far to project its image in the countries from the Eastern Neighbourhood? Is the European Union positively perceived at the societal level, or you feel there is a mismatch between the EU's expectations and the perceptions on the ground? And this is my final question.
Yeah, I think it is perceived positively, but then again, you know, I mean, maybe the EU has an issue, and you talk to EU officials and people that actually study and work for EU institutions, they tell you it has a strategic communications problem, selling its message very well. And we know, I mean, even for us in today's age where we are using social media, and even more so over the last 13 or 14 months where we are stuck in our homes and they've become home offices, and we follow, every time the EU puts something to promote itself, it's so damn boring. I mean, even that in itself, right? It's nice, it makes sense, but it's like, okay, can't you do something better to send a message? I mean, here you have a tremendous instrument, which is the visa-free regime towards 3 of its Eastern Partnership countries. Incredible. But again, is it actually working? Does it account for all segments of the societies? Because, you know, you have to meet certain criteria to be able to be able to travel within the EU. It's nice for us to sit down or to talk to EU experts about the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement and the web of bilateral agreements, creating a big web where this enhances over time. One can see trade and for the benefit of the countries of the Eastern Neighbourhood and the Eastern Partnership. But translate this to the people as well. I mean, how, you know, to say that fundamentally we are changing society and you are benefiting from it. And so I think there is a gap there in terms of communicating this properly, because ultimately, if you are in Moldova, you are worried about other things as well. And part of it also has to do with, you know, your own national governance structure and the fact that political elites are not, most of them are not up to par. And you know, if you are in Ukraine, you have to deal with that as well as the threat emanating from Russia, in Georgia as well. And so, you know, and so I think the EU, it's well perceived, but it could be doing more. And I think part of it is also linked to, you know, the whole question at the beginning about the EU's actorness and whether it's lost clout or not. Because if it rethinks, I mean, so strategic autonomy for me is not only important for the EU, but it's also important for the way it's going to be perceived exactly by its neighbors that want to come closer to the EU. It's going to have a tremendous impact on society if the EU is more forceful, is considered more of an actor in terms of, you know, crisis break. It's there to act immediately, and not just in terms of humanitarian or development assistance, or humanitarian is immediate, development takes more time, or otherwise, that it's there to mediate and negotiate. And to add to this, it's very interesting, the recent visit by the president of the Commission to Georgia. It's rare to have a president of the council come in. It should be doing more of this. This is good, because up to now, the neighborhood, I mean, I don't have the figures with me, but if we think ever since either the Eastern Partnership or even the Black Sea Synergy or the EU interest has been shown towards its Eastern neighborhood, how many high-level visits did the EU ever have from either its high representative or the president of the Commission or the president of the council to these countries to show that it's not just a technocratic process, which is creating these long-standing relationships, but it's much more than that. But there have been very few. And if you go through the last 20 years or so, there have been very few. So can you keep this up? The Michel-type visit by President of the Council or the High Representative or somebody else, can you keep this up and do more of this in the region? I think this would also influence positively the way societies in the neighboring countries view the European Union and its action.
Professor Dimitrios TRIANTAPHYLLOU, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this excellent take in our first unit of the course.
My pleasure. I don't know, maybe I rambled on, but but you've asked very interesting questions, and I think these are the questions that one needs to really think at all levels, whether it's someone like like yourself or myself that actually do study the EU and external action and so on, and whatever our positions might be on doing more, doing less, whether one is a student or whether one is a citizen of an EU member state or of a country of an EAP country, and then again, part of the reason, one of the issues also with the EU, we see this in our own societies and here I'm talking as a citizen of my country, Greece. So as someone coming, and you as a citizen of Romania, all right, we are national citizens of our countries and EU citizens, that we see a growing disconnect between the decision-making structure in Brussels. It's always been there, but because it's such a complicated process, we feel, never mind all the reforms that happen and subsidiarity and so on, growing disconnect between decisions taken there that affect us ultimately and decisions taken at national level. Imagine the societies of our neighboring countries, right? That do want to join, that do aspire to join, that do want change, or even the aspiration to come closer to the EU is to send a message to their political elites that even if we do not eventually join, at least we want societies that respect rule of law, that we as citizens feel protected by our institutions, right? Because that's what the EU projects, and so there is a disconnect that the EU needs to work on.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you. A pleasure.